The morning of September 11, 2001, began like any other for Jake, a 4-year-old golden retriever with a nose sharper than a bloodhound's and a heart bigger than the city he called home. His handler, Mike Callahan, a grizzled FDNY firefighter with 20 years on the job, was sipping coffee in their Brooklyn apartment when the first call came through. The radio crackled. A plane had hit the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Mike's face tightened and Jake, sensing the shift, stood at attention. His tail still but his eyes locked on his partner. "Time to work, boy," Mike said, grabbing Jake's harness. They were out the door in minutes, weaving through a city already choking on panic. The drive to Manhattan was a blur of sirens and smoke, the skyline marred by a wound that grew larger as they approached. By the time they reached ground zero, the second tower had collapsed, and the world was a chaos of ash, steel, and screams. Jake was one of the first search and rescue dogs on the scene. Trained since he was a pup, he'd worked house fires, collapsed buildings, and lost hiker cases, but nothing like this. The air was thick with pulverized concrete and the acrid sting of burning jet fuel. Mike clipped on Jake's lead, though he barely needed it. Jake knew his job. Find life. That was the mission, drilled into him through years of training. His nose twitched, sifting through the sensory overload, searching for the faint chemical signature of a living person. The pile, that's what they called the wreckage of the Twin Towers, was a jagged labyrinth of twisted metal and shattered stone. Jake moved with purpose, his paws padding over debris still warm from the collapse. Mike followed, calling out commands, but Jake was already ahead, his instincts sharper than any human's. He paused at a slab of concrete, sniffed, then barked, a sharp, urgent sound that cut through the din. Mike signaled to a nearby team, and they began digging. Minutes later, they pulled out a woman, dazed but alive, her face streaked with dust. She reached for Jake, her trembling hand brushing his fur. He licked her fingers, then turned back to the pile. There was more work to do. 4 hours Jake and Mike worked without pause. The sun climbed, then fell, but the pile didn't sleep. Neither did they. Jake's fur turned gray with ash. His paws bled from sharp edges, but he didn't slow. He found a firefighter trapped under a beam, his shallow breaths barely registering until Jake's nose caught them. He found a child, miraculously unharmed, curled in a pocket of rubble. Each find was a spark of hope in a place that felt like the end of the world. But for every life Jake found, there were dozens more he couldn't. The scent of death was everywhere, and it weighed on him, though he'd never show it. Mike saw it in the way Jake's ears drooped at the end of a long shift. But the dog never quit. Days blurred into nights. The pile was a living thing, shifting, groaning, hiding its secrets. Jake worked 12-hour shifts, sometimes longer, his stamina a marvel to the exhausted crews. Mike kept him fed and watered, cleaning his paws and whispering encouragement. "You're saving people, Jake. You're doing good." But Mike was struggling too. The weight of the loss, friends, colleagues, strangers, pressed on him. He'd seen too many body bags. Jake, though, was his anchor. The dog's focus, his relentless drive, kept Mike going when his own strength faltered. On the 5th day, Jake hit a wall. He'd been working a section of the South Tower's remains when he stopped, his body trembling. Mike knelt beside him, worried. "What's wrong, boy?" Jake's nose was still, his eyes distant. The vet on site checked him over. Dehydration, exhaustion, maybe smoke inhalation. They wanted to pull him from duty, but Jake wouldn't have it. After a bowl of water and a few minutes of rest, he was back on his feet, tugging at the leash. Mike shook his head, half proud, half terrified. "Stubborn mutt," he muttered, but he followed. The rescues slowed as the days stretched on. The pile yielded fewer survivors, more remains. Jake's job shifted from finding life to locating the lost, helping families find closure. It was grim work, but Jake didn't judge. He searched, he signaled, he moved on. The other dogs, labs, shepherds, a scrappy mutt named Daisy, worked alongside him, their handlers forming a tight-knit tribe. They shared coffee, stories, and the unspoken understanding that this was bigger than any of them. By the second week, Jake was a legend. News crews filmed him scrambling over the pile, his red harness a bright spot in the gray. Papers called him the hero of Ground Zero. Mike hated the attention. He knew Jake was just doing what he was born to do. But it lifted the spirits of the crews, so he let it slide. Jake didn't care about fame. He cared about the next cent, the next life, the next chance to make a difference. The work took its toll. Jake's cough worsened, a dry hack from the toxic dust. Mike's hands shook from fatigue. His dreams haunted by the faces of those they couldn't save. But they kept going because stopping wasn't an option. Not for Mike, who'd sworn an oath to the city. Not for Jake, who lived for the moment his bark brought someone back from the edge. Months passed. The pile shrank, cleared by cranes and human will. Jake and Mike stayed until the end, until the last piece of debris was carted away. They found 23 survivors in those first weeks, more than any other team, and countless remains that gave families a chance to grieve. When it was over, they went home to Brooklyn, to a world that felt too quiet, too normal. Jake lived another 6 years, though the dust in his lungs never left him. He retired from search and rescue but never stopped being a hero. He'd sit by the window, watching the city he'd helped save, his tail thumping when Mike came home. Mike, too, carried scars, physical and otherwise, but he'd stroke Jake's head and say, "We did all right, didn't we?" When Jake passed, the FDNY gave him a hero's send-off. Firefighters lined the street, saluting as his ashes were carried past. Mike didn't cry, he'd learned to keep that inside, but he felt the hole Jake left. The city did too. Ground Zero was rebuilt, but Jake's pawprints were there, in the stories of those he saved, in the hearts of those who worked beside him. Jake wasn't just a dog. He was a light in the dark, a reminder that even in the worst moments, there's something worth fighting for. And he fought tirelessly until the job was done.